go back to Mark chapter number 2. If you're new here, we're going through the book of Mark. We take books of the Bible, we go through them chapter by chapter, verse by verse, word for word. It's the greatest way, it's the best way to learn the scriptures. And we're in the Gospel of Mark right now, and we're going to wrap up Mark chapter number 2, and we're going to dip our toes into Mark chapter number 3. Before I do, I was thinking yesterday morning, as I was reading through these verses, of something that happened to me years ago in the middle of a sermon. So I was preaching like I normally do on Sunday mornings, and a gentleman in a suit walked into the church, and he stood in the back of the room. And he never sat down, he just stood there, and he stared at me the entire sermon. And when the service came to a close, after talking to, handshaking a bunch of people, he comes to me afterwards, he takes me aside to a private place, and for 10 to 15 minutes, he rebukes me. He calls me to repentance of a particular sin. He tells me that I need to repent of that sin and that I need to publicly, the following Sunday, publicly confess that sin to the congregation, to repent of that sin, and then to change my ways. Now you say, what was that sin that he was, so adamant that he came to church and waited and politely took me aside and just harshly rebuked me for 10, it felt like eternity, but it's kind of awkward. Some people were walking by and stuff, kind of an awkward little moment. So what was it, this thing that he was so passionate about that he felt compelled that he had to do that? Well, the sin that I was committing was that God forbid, I was preaching on Sunday and not observing the Sabbath. I should have been preaching on the Sabbath, not Sunday. This was a Sabbath-day Adventist that spoke to me, and he believed that it was his job in life to go around to all of the other churches that doesn't observe the Sabbath and rebuke their pastors face to face and call them to repentance. And as I was reading through these verses, I was thinking to myself, as much as I didn't like that moment, I don't mind it that much because it kind of puts me in a category of the same thing happened to Jesus. And we're going to be reading about that in these verses here because he supposedly did not observe the Sabbath the way that the religious elites believe that he should have observed the Sabbath. And so if you're there in Mark chapter number 2, look at verse number 23. It says, "Now it happened that as he went through the grain fields on the Sabbath," so the Sabbath is a Saturday, and Mark's Gospel just simply opens this story, this narrative here, with "now it happened." But Luke's account adds these words. Luke's account says that it happened the second Sabbath after the first. And Mark, in his Gospel, didn't record what happened 7 days earlier in that first Sabbath, but John's Gospel does. And so I want to read it, a little bit of it for you. You could turn there if you want. It's in John chapter number 5, where this first Sabbath takes place. And to set the context, 7 days earlier, Jesus is in Galilee here. He's walking through the grain fields. He's picking grain along with his disciples, and it's Saturday. 7 days before that, he's not in Galilee. He's down in Jerusalem, which is a long journey. So this was... It's always interesting to me when you chronologically look at the life of Jesus in his earthly ministry. It is mind-blowing how much, territory he would span in a very short period of time. There are days when he would walk up to 30 miles in a day. He would preach and perform miracles in a village and then walk 30 miles to another, and by the time he gets to it in the evening, he would spend the rest of the night preaching and healing people. The exhaustive life that Jesus had to have lived is hard for us to wrap our minds around. Now, why is he in Jerusalem? He only went to Jerusalem several times in his earthly ministry. If you were a good Jew, particularly a Jewish man, you were required to go to Jerusalem at least 3 times a year, if not more than that, for particular feasts. And so that's why he would cease his ministry in Galilee. He would go down and perform what was required of the law for him to perform. And so here he is in the middle of the summer. He's in Jerusalem. And in John chapter 5, it says that he is walking by the pool of Bethesda. And there's a lame man there that he sees. And this man he's been lame for 38 years of his life. Now, he's laying by this pool because there was a superstitious idea that the water would stir, bubbles would come up, maybe an angel is stirring the water, and if you get into it at the right time, whoever's first gets healed. And so he's laying there, but he's lame, and so he says, I can't ever get there first because I'm kind of crawling, I'm pulling myself, but all the people with their legs, they're faster than me. They jump in there before me. And now, there's no evidence that no one was actually getting healed, or people that were actually getting healed at this. It was just kind of a superstitious idea. But Jesus is looking at this man intently, and Jesus gives him a command. He says, rise, take up your bed and walk. There's no need for you to lay here for another 38 years to wait for this. Now, the problem is this. You say that there's a problem with that? Yeah, there actually was technically a little problem with that whole scene there. It was the Sabbath. And, well, you can't be telling people to pick up their beds because that's work, and to go home, to walk further than a Sabbath day's journey. If you've never heard that phrase, I'll unpack it in a moment. You can't do that. So he tells this guy to pick up his bed and to walk home. Now the Pharisees are standing nearby and they see this. And they see this man carrying his bed, and they look at the man carrying his bed, and they know this man. He's been laying there for 38 years. The Pharisees, they live there. They're on these streets all the time. They're very familiar with this person. And so they see this guy that they've known to be lame for 38 years. He's walking now, and he's carrying his bed. But instead of being shocked that, Henry's walking. What in the world? This is crazy. I can't believe it. What happened? Instead of that, it's, what are you doing? It's Saturday. Put the bed down now, sir. Step away from the bed. It's like they're losing their mind. You can't be doing this on the Sabbath. And it says in verse number 9 of John chapter 5, because they ask him, who told you to do this? Why are you doing this thing? And verse number 9 says, and immediately the man was made well, took up his bed and walked, and that day was the Sabbath. Verse number 10, the Jews therefore said to him, who was cured, it is the Sabbath, it is not lawful for you to carry your bed. Now look at verse number 15. Skip ahead a little bit here. They asked him, who told you to do this? He didn't know. Jesus healed him and kept walking. It was just kind of like, yeah, take up your bed. And he did. He's like, what? It actually happened. It worked. And so later on, Jesus finds this man and tells him not to sin anymore either. But in verse number 15, the man goes back to the Jews. In verse 15, it says, the man departed and told the Jews that it was Jesus who made him well. Now, verse 16 is important, if you're there in John 5. For this reason, the Jews persecuted Jesus and sought to kill him. A little extreme, maybe. Heals a guy, tells him to pick up his bed and go home. Lawbreaker. Guess what? Jesus is a big lawbreaker. Telling people, he wasn't even the one that broke the law, the traditional law, the rabbinical law, but he told someone else to do it. That's worthy of death. Let that sink in for a moment. You say, well, why did they crucify Jesus? Because he healed a man on Saturday? It's one of the main reasons. Healed a man on Saturday. He should die. Well, it goes on to say there in John chapter 5, verse number 17 says, well, actually, verse 16 ends with this. Because he had done these things on the Sabbath, verse 17, but Jesus answered them, my Father has been working until now, and I have been working. Oh, if you think breaking the Sabbath wasn't bad enough, he literally just said, my Father, God, who is in heaven, he works on Saturdays too. And I'm his son. I'm working on Saturdays as well. Now that's blasphemy in their eyes. And so it says in verse 18, therefore the Jews sought all the more to kill him because he not only broke the Sabbath, but also said that God was his Father, making himself equal with God. Jesus is equal with God. I and the Father are one, he told his disciples. But this is why when people ask, why was Jesus crucified? This is the reason. And it began early in his ministry. It took a long time before they were able finally to get him on the cross, but this is where it began. It began with him breaking the Sabbath, should die. He broke the Sabbath. And then, on top of that, an even worse crime is he claimed to be equal with God. Now, with that as the background, go back to Mark chapter number 2, because 7 days later, Jesus declares war on these religious elites. If you remember, they had traveled up to Galilee as well. They wanted to hear and see everything that Jesus was doing so that they could condemn him. They had already determined he should die. So now they're just waiting for him to break the law again. Break the law again. Do something worthy that we can arrest you here and now and crucify you. And so they're waiting for this. And this is really what Mark chapter 2 is all about. Mark 2 is a declaration of a war against the religious elites of Judaism. You have the Sadducees who are there. You have the Pharisees who are there. You even have representatives of the Sanhedrin who are there. You have zealots who are there. You have Hellenists who are there as well, which we'll see in just a moment. So really, anyone and everyone who has a position of power and authority in the land of Israel, they're all now watching with their hawk eyes to see if Jesus is going to do something that will give them permission to legally arrest him. That's what they're waiting for. And in chapter number 2, Jesus goes right to the heart of Judaism. He goes right to the heart of what they prized more than anything else. There were 2 laws in the Old Testament that in Judaism that they loved to debate and argue and fight over more than anything else. One was circumcision and the other was the Sabbath. And since circumcision only happened one time in a young man's life on the 8th day after his birth, and it was fairly simple and straightforward, there wasn't a lot to talk about, even though they did have quite a lot to talk about when it comes to circumcision. The other was the Sabbath. And the Sabbath, they had a lot to say. In fact, when they talked about and argued over the law, it was the Sabbath laws that they were arguing over more than anything else. In the Talmud itself, there's over 39 sections dedicated to Sabbath rule. There are 24 chapters to just Sabbath observance alone. You say, well, that's not that much, except for the fact that there are thousands and thousands of nuanced commands in those chapters. One rabbi said that he spent 2.5 years studying one chapter just so that he could try to memorize and understand. And if you've ever seen the Talmud, it's a massive volume that took many, many years. And most of it was compiled after the time of Christ, but it was all being developed and debated and talked about during the lifetime of Christ. And this is Sabbatarianism. This is Judaism at its heart. You say, what do the Jews believe? Well, more than anything else, they believe in Sabbath law. That is the means of righteousness for them. That is their means of grace. That is how you become right with God, Sabbath observance. I've been in Israel on the Sabbath before. It can be a miserable place to be on the Sabbath. If you're staying at a hotel and you're on the top floor and it's Saturday, well, it's going to take you a few minutes to get there because on Saturdays, you don't touch any buttons. The elevators just kind of go automatically and they stop at every single floor as they go up and down so that you won't have to do any work because that's work, and you can't do that. In fact, you can't do any kind of work on the Sabbath. And this is part of the rabbinical tradition that goes on for years and years. And during the time of Christ, it was just as common. You have Sabbath, which Shabbat is the word it comes from. There's 2 B's in there. So the double beta from the Greek language there is a overemphasis of the importance of this word. So Shabbat is to cease, it's to desist, it's to rest, it's to stop, is the idea behind it. And they take it to the furthest extreme. Now you say, well, what is Sabbath rest? What is the Sabbath command to begin with? Well, it's actually very, very simple. It begins all the way back in the book of Genesis. 6 days God created heaven and earth and all that is, and on the seventh day He rested. He gave us the kind of the example. Rested. He took a break from His work, which was a sign, and I'll get to that later. It was a sign. It was symbolizing something. He didn't rest because He got tired. God doesn't have muscles. God doesn't get fatigued. He didn't rest on the Sabbath because He got tired. He rested because it's a symbol. It's a sign of something more important. But he gave this, and I emphasize the word gave. You do know that in the Ten Commandments, it is also a command to honor the Sabbath. But it's one of those unique commands in the Old Testament that it is a gift and it is a command at the same time. And that's really important that you understand that. And the reason it's important for you to understand that because the Bible teaches us in the New Testament that Christ is our Sabbath. And Christ is both a command and a gift to humanity. And I'll make more sense of that as we get to the end of this. But it was a command. Honor the Sabbath. What does that mean? Well, the Bible was very vague on that. It was, don't work. 6 days of the week, you can work in the fields. You can watch over your flocks. You can, if you're a blacksmith, you can work in your shop. But on the seventh day, the Sabbath day, no work. It's a day of rest. Let your body rest. Let your mind rest. Let your crops rest. Let the land rest. Take a break. And that's really all it was about. It was take a break. It's a day off. And it was a gift. It was a command, but it was more than a command. It was a gift. It was a gift so that you don't overburden yourself, so that you don't overwork yourself. You don't become a workaholic. Take a break. Take a breather. Go swimming. Get a hammock. Lay in a tree. Take a nice little walk through the park. Enjoy a day off. Don't work yourself to death. Rest your mind. Rest your body. That was the gift that He gave to them. But for the Jewish people, that gift had become the greatest of all burdens. It was, and the reason why is because of the vagueness of the command in the Torah, the law, they said, well, rest, don't work, do no labor. What does that mean? They want, give me details. I want details. What does it mean, no labor? And so they would debate and argue forever over, well, what is work? What is labor? What constitutes as labor? What does it mean to rest? What does it mean to not do anything? And so what did they get out of that? Well, you would get things like, you're not allowed to light a candle or a lamp on Saturday. So if you wanted light on Saturday, you better light that. You better have a pretty big candle and light it the night before because it would begin in the evening of Friday. You weren't allowed to walk more than a Sabbath day's journey. You say, what is a Sabbath day's journey? It's interesting what a Sabbath day. A Sabbath day's journey is 1,999 steps. And if you go one more step, that would be 2,000 steps, and you would be sinning. You would be violating a Sabbath day's journey. And if somehow you forgot how many steps you took, you can remember the feet, because it's roughly around 3,000 feet. Or you could measure it in your mind, because a Sabbath day's journey is basically from downtown Jerusalem to the summit of the Mount of Olives. That was a Sabbath day's journey, so you could work it out. Now, a lot of times, there would be a problem, though. There's no food in the house. I need to go further than 1,999 steps, and so they would create new laws. So what you could do is on Friday, if you take a piece of food and you go out to 1,999 feet and put that piece of food down, that will give you now permission to walk another 1,999 feet. And if you come into a city, and because you could only freely walk around inside your house, in your dwelling, And you could walk as much as you could walk more than 1,000, more than 2,000, more than 3,000 feet inside your house. But if you went outside your house, then you were restricted to how far you could walk. But there are loopholes that have come about. Because in the alleys, if you're walking in town and there's an alley, if you take a rope and lay the rope across the alley, that will give you permission now to walk another 1,999 feet. And because basically what you've done is you've created the alley into your dwelling. It's like your house. It's like the outdoor portion of your house. And so you could do this wherever you went. It's like, this is my house now, and this is my house. And you could go shopping wherever you wanted. You could walk up and down all over town as long as you had a rope with you to give you permission to do such things as that. There were all kinds of laws like that. And by the way, I could spend months, probably years, unpacking all of them, which I won't. I'm just going to throw out a couple of them. You couldn't climb trees on the Sabbath because that's work. But also, if you climbed a tree, there's the potential that you might break a limb, and that would be considered pruning. And you shouldn't be able to do that. And you can't ride an animal. You can't ride a donkey or anything like that, because what if you mistakenly break a limb or step on something on the ground, a limb, and it cracks or something like that? You'd be breaking the Sabbath. So no riding of any type of animals. You can't kill any insects on the Sabbath day, because that would, if you swatted a fly or a mosquito and you killed it, that would be hunting. And there's no hunting allowed on the Sabbath. And it gets into details. You can't trap a fly underneath a jar, because that would be trapping. And you can't do trapping or hunting or anything like that. And so these laws went on and on like that. You can't squeeze juice from a fruit. There's no lemon juice. There's no orange juice on the Sabbath. You can't do anything like that. That'd be work. You can't, you can't cook an egg on the Sabbath. And a lot of people thought there was a loophole to that. Well, it gets really hot in the sandy deserts of Jerusalem. I can just put an egg in the sand and let it cook that way. Like, no, that's work too. You can't do that. Well, I didn't do anything, but yeah, you did. You took a normal egg and now you can eat it. It's boiled. You can't do that. That was work. None of that. And that's still true today in Jerusalem, by the way. You cook everything on Friday. And you don't turn your microwave on, and you don't do anything. And if you're deciding to cook at all, you have ovens that have timers, and they'll come on at a certain time and they'll warm your food up. And there's all kinds of little tricks that they've come up with. You can't brush dried mud off of your clothes or your shoes, because that would be considered grinding, and you can't do any type of grinding or milling. You can't take a bath, because you'd be cleaning yourself. But more importantly than that, if the water that you're taking a bath in comes off of you and it hits the floor and it washes the floor, then that would be washing something. And so you can't do that. You can't open an umbrella. You can't have a folding screen of any kind to keep the sun off of you. You can't carry anything. Now, I say you can't carry anything. You can carry something a Sabbath day's journey, or if you're inside your house, only 6 feet. But it has to be no more than the weight of a dried fig, or half a fig carried 2 times. Very detailed rules here. Now, let's say you had a fig in your hand, and you decided to throw it up in the air. If you threw that fig up in the air and you caught it with the other hand, then that would be sin. You couldn't do that. But if you threw that fig up in the air and you caught it with the same hand, then you would be fine with that. Are you starting to get some of the details here? And when it comes to carrying, there were rules against carrying in private and public. You could carry something from a private place in your home and sit it down in a public place, or something in a public place to a private place. And there was all kinds of detailed rules about where you could pick something up and where you could sit it down and how you could get away, and loopholes to go along with all of that type of stuff as well. Tailors were not allowed to carry their needles. Scribes were not allowed to carry their pens. Students were not allowed to carry their books, because all of that might be a temptation to actually use those things on the Sabbath. You say, what do you do on the Sabbath? It's a really big question. I think you just stare. But I don't think you can blink your eyes too many times. That might be worse. I'm not sure. There's really, if you can imagine, you're living as a Jew in the first century, Saturday's miserable. This gift from God. Take a day off. Do something enjoyable. Don't work yourself to death. Has now become the most labor-intensive day of the week. Can I do this? Can I do that? I can't do it. It's a burden. It's a huge, huge burden. And this is what Jesus is addressing there's going to be multiple times where the Sabbath comes up. And you might, ask the question, well, is there anything that you can do on the Sabbath? There's some things. There are some things that you can do on the Sabbath. You can write letters. Not a full letter. You can write a letter. Two, in fact. You can write two letters, A and B, or a combination of other stuff. But you can't write more than two letters. So you can come up with, code in order to communicate with other people, because you can't, if you needed to say something to somebody that lives on the other side of town, you couldn't get it to them. So you could write two letters and kind of come up with a code. People who can walk a Sabbath day's journey, they can eventually get it to them. You can sew on the Sabbath. 1 stitch is what you were allowed. So if something, you rip your clothes and you need to fix it, 1 stitch should be sufficient to get you through the day. At least to cover up the private parts or whatever. It's like, okay, in emergency, 1 stitch. That'll get me through the next 8 hours here. There were things that you could do, but they were silly and ridiculous. One of the things you were allowed to do on the Sabbath, and this is an important one because it correlates with our text here. You were allowed to help someone if they were dying. So if a building falls down and there's someone trapped inside the building, and if you don't pull them out, they're going to die, you could break the Sabbath law and you could remove the rubble and you could pull that person to life. If someone needed CPR or whatever, you could help them. If they were cut really bad and they're bleeding, you could help bind that wound so that they could live. But you were not allowed to help anyone who was sick or didn't have a death-related type illness. If it wasn't like, oh, they're going to die if I don't step in right now, then it's like, that can wait until Sunday. They're not bleeding to death. They may lose the arm or the leg, but don't worry about it. We'll deal with this tomorrow. So that's important for what we're going to be looking at. So with that said, go back to Mark chapter number 2 and look at verse number 23 once again. Now it happened. So now that you have kind of a context of what a Sabbath day looks like, the restrictions and so forth, and there's so much more, by the way. There's so much more. Now you have kind of the understanding of how the Pharisees view the Sabbath. Notice what Jesus does on the Sabbath. Verse 23. Now it happened that he went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and as they went, his disciples began to, oh my goodness, pluck the heads of grain. Oh, it gets worse. And they ate them, rubbing them in their hands. Luke's gospel tells us that. So here you have the disciples plucking grain, rubbing it in their hands, blowing off the chaff, and eating the grains. And it's Saturday. How many laws were just broken? Well, let's look at these verses again. Verse 23. They went through the grain fields. Okay, the grain fields are not in town. They're not in the village. They probably have already broken the Sabbath day journey. Now, take note here, the Pharisees are out there watching them. They probably broke the Sabbath day journey rules, but they're hypocrites and they don't care about stuff like that. So that's one. And the disciples began to pluck the heads of grain. Okay, well, that's breaking the Sabbath law of harvesting. They're out there harvesting wheat and they're sifting it. That's breaking another rule. Luke's account tells us that they rubbed it in their hands. That's to get the husk off of it. So if you know anything about how wheat works or barley, it's got kind of like a shell around it. So you're going to rub it in your hand. You can get the husk, the shell off of it, and you blow it off. And then you'd have like the seed, so like a sunflower seed type thing, to get the hard shell off of it, and you can eat it. Well, by them doing that they're breaking the threshing law. You can't thresh on the Sabbath. And you can't harvest on the Sabbath. And, the willowing, blowing the chaff off, that's a willowing. You can't do that. These guys are just criminals. Now, some of you might be going, I don't think that's the problem, though. I think the problem is they're in somebody's field stealing their wheat. Maybe that's the problem. But even that is not the problem. And the Pharisees know this. They didn't bring that up. They say, oh, you thieves. It's like, no, they're not thieves. And the reason why is because in Deuteronomy 23 and verse number 24, it gives permission for that. It says, when you come into your neighbor's vineyard, you may eat your fill of grapes at your pleasure, but you shall not put any in your containers. So if you're walking through the vineyard and you're hungry, grab a couple of grapes and eat them. God says that's fine. But don't start, collecting them. Don't start harvesting. That's thievery. In the very next verse, he says, when you come into your neighbor's standing grain, you may pluck the heads with your hand, but you shall not use a sickle on your neighbor's standing grain. In other words, don't go and harvest your neighbor's grain. That's thievery. But if you're on a journey, you're walking and you're hungry and you'd like something to eat, grab a couple of grains and eat it and don't go hungry. God doesn't want you to go hungry. So he says, that's not thievery. You can do that. That's the law, by the way. That's in the Torah. So they're not thieves. What law are they breaking? Are they actually breaking a Sabbath day law? The answer is no, they're not. What they're breaking is the traditions of the rabbis, who knew the law was take a day of rest, but just could not for the life of them figure out what that meant. So maybe it means this and this and this, and maybe it means these 10,000 other things. And they created all of these traditional laws that were treated like doctrine, and you have to follow them. And so they're looking at Jesus, verse 24, and it says, the Pharisee said to him, look, why do you do what is not lawful on the Sabbath? They're accusing Jesus of breaking the law, but it's not God's law. It's their rabbinical traditional laws. It's all of these silly, weird, quirky rules about observing the Sabbath. Now, Jesus answers them, and he could have answered them in many different ways, but he answers them as he often does. He says in verse 25, he said to them, have you never read? He is speaking to those who spent their entire life reading the Scriptures, memorizing. By the age of 12, they've memorized the Torah, first 5 books of the Bible. They sit around and they debate each other about what the Bible is talking about, what it says, what it means. Jesus does this because he picks at them. That is one of the most insulting things you could say to this group. These are scholars. These are Bible scholars. At least they think of themselves as that. And he's like, you haven't read the Bible? You don't know what it says? And this is one of the typical things Jesus would say to the Pharisees. Have you never read? Have you not seen? Did you not know in the Scriptures? Go read the Gospels sometime. You're going to see Jesus mentioning this again and again and again and again to them. In Matthew 22 and verse number 29, Jesus said to these Pharisees, you are mistaken not knowing the Scriptures. That was the problem. You read the Scriptures, but you mistaken what they say and what they mean. You misinterpret them. You misapply them. You may have read the Scriptures, but you don't know what they're saying. You don't know what they mean. And he brings up one story from 1 Samuel 21. He says in verse number 25 once again, have you never read what David did when he was in need and hungry, he and those with him? Now, to set the context here, David is fleeing for his life. He's with his mighty men. King Saul's trying to kill David. They've been in battle. They've been at war. And they're at a point of starvation in this scene. And it's Saturday. And they have nothing to eat. And they know nobody else has anything to eat because it's Saturday. They've only prepared enough for them in their homes. And so David does the only thing that he knows to do is he goes to the priests. And he asks the priests, do you have any food? Now, the reason he goes to the priest and asks, do you have any food? Because he knows that the priests have food on the Sabbath. Because one of the priestly jobs was on Saturday, you would take the 12 loaves of bread that sits out on the showbread table, which is the bread of presence. It sits there in the presence of God, and there's 12 loaves because it represents the 12 tribes of Israel, and it sits out on the table of showbread. And every Saturday, they would prepare new loaves of bread to replace the old ones. And so they'd go in on the Sabbath and they would take the old ones out and put the new ones there. And the old loaves of bread is what the priest would eat. So David knows this. This is the tradition that's been followed for hundreds and hundreds of years. And so Jesus says at the end of verse number 25, what David, when he was in need and hungry, he and those with him, how he went into the house of God in those days of Abiathar, the high priest, and ate the showbread, which is not lawful to eat except for the priest, and also gave to those who were with him. So Jesus reminds them of a story that I know they've read many times, but never really paused, I guess, to think about what it actually means. Now, the priest who gave this, and this would have been Ahimelech, who was the high priest at this time. Jesus mentions Abiathar. And Abiathar is the son of Ahimelech. He becomes high priest a little bit later on, but this is during the time period of Abiathar. Abiathar is the high priest who is well known. He served for a very long time. Ahimelech did not serve for a very long time. And so Jesus uses Abiathar as a reminder of the time period. Back in the time period of Abiathar, when David went in, he revealed to them that this priest, Ahimelech, was wise. He understood the law. And he knew that the law says that this bread is only for the priest to eat. But here is David and his men, and they are hungry. They are at the point of starvation. And the law of love always supersedes ceremonial law. The law of mercy, the law of grace. This is why James refers to the law of love as the royal law. It is the law by which all other laws must submit to. It rules over all the other laws. And so the high priest knew, should I reserve this ceremonial bread and keep it for myself and the other priests and not allow these men to eat this bread and let them die of starvation? That's not loving. That's not merciful. That's not gracious. That's not what God would want. And so he very wisely gives it to David and to his men. Now, in Matthew's account of this same event, Matthew tells us that Jesus said a little bit more. In Matthew 12, verse number 5, Jesus also said this, "Or have you not read in the law that on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless?" What does he mean by that? Profane the Sabbath and they're blameless. Well, once again, the Pharisees and everyone else that's the Jew, they're not allowed to cook bread on Saturday. They're not allowed to walk a Sabbath day journey. They're not allowed to light a candle. They're not allowed to perform sacrifices. They're not allowed to do any of those things. But the priests do those things. The priests go in and do all these things that would be against your Sabbath rules. And they were doing that in the time of Jesus as well. They just gave them a slip. They said, well, they're priests. They can do those things. They have to do those things for their job. And so Jesus says, well, they're blameless. Verse number 6 of Matthew 12, he says, "Yet I say that in this place there is one greater than the temple." Speaking of himself, the priest can do those things on Saturday and you give them a slip, and someone who is greater than the temple itself is standing in front of you and you're not giving me a slip? You're not letting me pass on this? Wow. Verse number 7, he goes on to say, "But if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would have not condemned the guiltless." Jesus said, I'm guiltless. My men are guiltless. If you had understood the law of mercy, which he's quoting from Hosea, if you would understand that what God desires love, God desires mercy more than you following these ceremonial laws to the T, dotting your I's and crossing your T's, exactly correct, and yet you're willing to let people die of starvation. That's not the heart of God. Well, if you're there in Mark chapter number 2, look at verse 27. If all that Jesus had said at this point wasn't enough to make them lose their ever-living mind, my son gets angry at me a lot of times because I poke it. Maybe I push it a little too far. I like to joke. I joke and I pry and I like to cut up and have it. And I probably push it too far. And I think Jesus, he's here in this situation and he's ready to just push it over the edge. He is ready for these guys to absolutely lose their mind. And so he says in verse 27, and he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. Therefore, the Son of Man is also Lord of the Sabbath. Jesus says, I am Lord of your prized law. I'm sovereign. Lord means, this is an interesting word that he uses here, kurios. It's a word that they would be familiar with because it's the word that they would, in the place of Yahweh, God, they would use kurios. So this would be the name that would be typical for God. Lord, the Master, the Sovereign One. Jesus says, I can do whatever I bloody well want to do on Saturday because it's my day. I'm the Lord of it. I started it. I created that command. I rule it. You cannot tell me what to do on this day. Now, he also is making a very important point that I think the rest of us should follow as well. Verse 27, he says, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. What do you mean by that? The Sabbath was meant to serve man, not man serve the Sabbath. They had flipped it around to where their entire life was serving the Sabbath. What do you want me to do, Sabbath? You want me to not wear this? You want me to not go here? You want me to not eat this? Every part of their Saturday was about serving the Sabbath law. And Jesus said, God didn't create it for that reason. He created it to serve you. It was a gift to you. It was meant to bless you. It was to make your life more, fulfilling and peaceful and relaxing so that you're not working yourself to death. It's meant to serve you, which means you get to decide what you do on Saturday. You say, what am I going to do on Saturday? If it were me, I'm playing disc golf or fishing or something. I'm going on a hike. That's my idea of a rest. For some people, their idea of a rest is running a marathon. Doesn't sound restful, but to them it's fun. That's enjoyable. They look forward to that. That's their vacation. It's their little hobby. It's not going to work and doing something enjoyable. It's resting in that way. It's a mental, physical rest from the normal routine of life. But Jesus says, you've made it a burden. Therefore, verse 28, therefore the Son of Man, which will remind you, that's a Daniel 7 title for the Messiah. Jesus says the Messiah is also Lord of the Sabbath. If you and I, if the Sabbath was meant to rule you and you were meant to rule the Sabbath, and that applies to all men, then Jesus is saying, I, the Son of Man, I who am man, but I'm also God, I have that same privilege. I have the same right to determine what I'm going to do on Saturday because I'm the master of it. But there's a twofold meaning here. It is just as every person has a right to make a decision on what they're going to do on Sabbath, on Saturday, on their day off, I also have that right, but even more so because I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. I'm God, is what he's saying. If you didn't pick that up, he's saying, I am God. And that just blows their mind. Now, very quickly here, look at chapter 3, and we won't spend a lot of time in these first couple of verses here. Because what he does at this point is he basically walks away from the field, walks into a synagogue and says, I am going to now show you what it means to be Lord over the Sabbath. And he says in verse number 1, and he entered the synagogue again, and a man was there who had a withered hand. Jesus already knew this. That's why he went there. So they watched him closely. Like, we'll see what he does. Let's see if he breaks the law. The moment you announce that you're living for God, people will be watching you, particularly those that want to tear you down. So they're ready to tear Jesus down. They're watching him intently, whether he would heal on the Sabbath so that they might accuse him. Now think about how nonsensical that statement is. Oh, he's going to do something real bad today. Last Saturday, he healed a guy. And there's a guy in here who's got a withered hand. I bet he's going to do it again. This guy is so bad, I can't wait to kill him. Think about how nonsensical. This is what religion does, if you haven't figured this out. Religion will make you think so warped-mindedly to where something that is so beautiful and good as healing people makes your blood boil and makes you want to kill someone. Religion has a way of turning morals completely around. And so they're like, if he does it, we're going to accuse him. Verse number 3. And he said to the man who had the withered hand, step forward. Then he said to them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? Now, if you remember, according to their rules, you can't save a life, or you can save a life on the Sabbath, but you can't heal someone. You can't help someone who doesn't have a life-threatening illness or issue. And what Jesus is asking them is, look at this man. He's got a withered hand. He's probably had it a long time. There's no death threat going on here. I can heal this. I can make that thing whole. That would be good. That would be a righteous thing. That would be a good thing. Is it good to do good on Saturday, or should I do evil? Now, notice they kept silent, which is kind of strange because they like to talk a lot. But they kept silent because there's nothing to be said here. Jesus' question to them is so straightforward, there's no way to answer it other than, of course, it's good to do good on the Sabbath. Of course, it's wrong to do evil on the Sabbath. But they're not going to answer him because they're not interested in what's good. They're not interested in what's right or wrong or any of that. They're only interested in their religion. They're only interested in condemning him. And so they kept silent. Verse 5, and when he had looked around at them with anger, being grieved, that was the source of his anger. He was angry because he was grieved over their hard-heartedness. He was grieved over how their religion had corroded their morals so badly. They couldn't see what was right. They couldn't see what was wrong. They didn't understand the Scripture. They were reading the Scriptures, but they couldn't interpret it correctly. Their lives are just a wreck. And it angered him because these are the religious leaders. And that word anger, by the way, that's the only time in the New Testament that explicitly says that Jesus was angry. Yes, there are the times when he flips the tables over in the temple. 2 times, in fact, that he does that. And there's other examples as well. But this is the only time that it explicitly says. And it uses in the Greek a harsh word for anger. He was not just angry, he was furious. He was furious at their hard hearts. And the source of that anger was his grieved heart. He was grieved over what the Jewish people had become. And so it says he was angry and grieved by the hardness of their hearts. So he said to the man, stretch out your hand. And he stretched it out, and his hand was restored as whole as the other. It didn't take it a long period of time. It wasn't over a period of months and weeks. It was the shriveled up, paralyzed hand is now back to normal, functioning as it ought to. This would have been visible, by the way. They're sitting around, they're watching because they're staring. They would have seen the hand miraculously come back to being what it ought to be. So they would have, with their own eyes, seen a miracle happen. And what was their response? Well, verse number 6, then the Pharisees went out and immediately plotted with the Herodians against him how they might destroy him. In other words, how can we kill him? And they plot, this is the Pharisees, so this is your ultra-Orthodox Jews. Ultra-conservative, live and die by all the thousands of rules that they have created. And here's another group, the Herodians. These are those who believe that Herod the Great has a right to the throne and that they are sympathizers with Rome, and they adhere more to the Greco-Roman lifestyle. They're Hellenist in that sense, and that they're secular, they're non-religious. This would be like ultra conservative, hyper conservative individuals over here, and then ultra leftists over here, non-religious, and then getting along. Let's team up. Like Seahawk fans and Patriot fans coming together and saying, let's work together on this. This is what's going on here. Lifelong enemies with one another. That's what they are. Lifelong enemies with one another, who says, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. You are my friend. You hate Jesus. I hate Jesus. You want Jesus dead. I want Jesus dead. He's a menace. He's a problem. Let's plan out how we can make this happen. And this is early in Jesus' ministry. We're only in Mark chapter number 2. Now we're in 3. But we're early in the ministry of Jesus. So from this point on, the death sentence was already on Jesus. It took a few years in order for it to be accomplished, but they had already made up their mind, he must be eliminated. We've got to figure out how to kill him. And eventually they do. Now the sad thing is this. These are those who know the law. They know the scriptures, and they would have known the prophet Ezekiel. And they would have known what Ezekiel said in Ezekiel 20 and verse number 12. When God, speaking through Ezekiel, said, moreover, I also gave them my Sabbaths to be a sign between them and me, that they may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies them. God had told the Jewish nation that your sanctification does not come through your Sabbath observance. Your sanctification comes through me. And I gave you the Sabbath as a sign to remind you of that. It was a gift and a command at the same time. And as I had mentioned before, Jesus is that gift and he is that command. In Matthew 11 and verse number 28, Jesus said this, come to me, all who labor, that's a command, and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Now, what is he talking about? Come to me, all of you who are labored and burdened down by the law, labored and burdened down by the restrictions of the Sabbath day observance, labored and burdened down by all the rules and regulations of the religious elites. Come to me and I will give you rest from that. I will free you from that. It's a command and it's a gift. The command is you turn from your self-righteousness and let me gift you my righteousness and enter into my rest. This is why Jesus refers to himself as the Sabbath. He is the Sabbath. The Sabbath is a sign of Jesus. It points to Jesus. And this is why Paul said in Colossians 2, verse 16, let no one judge you in food or in drink or regarding a festival or a new moon or Sabbaths, which are a shadow of the things to come, but the substance is Christ. Christ is what the Sabbath was all about. It was you taking a physical day off to remind you that in the future, we don't just get a day off. We get eternity away from this burdensome world, this burdensome life, the burdensome rules of this world. And in Christ, we are liberated. In Christ, we are freed. You say, well, how do I get to enjoy that? How do I get to be part of that? Well, you just do it. Jesus said, come to me. You can do that right now. Just come to Jesus. Have your come to Jesus moment right now. Come to Jesus, say, I give up. I put up the white flag of surrender. I'm not going to try to work my way to heaven anymore. I'm not going to try to be good enough to get me there anymore. I'm going to rest in your labor. I'm going to rest in your work. I'm going to put my trust in you. I'm going to let you do the saving, not me. That's what it means to let Jesus be your Sabbath. And if you've ever wondered as a Christian, why do Christians not observe the Sabbath? Well, that's because we live in the Sabbath 7 days a week. There's no longer one special day to remember those promises and look forward to those signs of that happening. I am in that Sabbath now, enjoying that Sabbath, and will for all of eternity. And all who are in Christ get to participate in that as well.